Good afternoon. My name is Tina Kepi, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held on the third Thursday of every month in room 303 on the third floor of the City County Building in Lincoln. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found on our website at nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television and on our YouTube page. Today's speaker is Jim Potter, Senior Research Historian at the Nebraska State Historical Society. He will be talking about Spotted Tail, the government's favorite Indian. Please join me in welcoming Jim Potter.
Thank you very much, and welcome. The title of my talk is one that I chose, which I think represents how many government officials and other observers felt about Spotted Tail. I don't know that there's any document that literally says he's our favorite Indian, but there are some comments that certainly lead you in that direction. And he's a favorite of mine as well, and hopefully after you hear me talk a little bit, you'll understand why. None of the Lakota leaders who contended with the government in war and in peace during the late 19th century was more accomplished or successful than Spotted Tail of the Brule Lakota. Yet he has been overshadowed by the attention focused on his contemporaries, Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, and Sitting Bull. All three earned notoriety for waging war against the whites in an ultimately futile effort to preserve Lakota lands and ways of life. Spotted Tail was no less committed to these goals, but sought to achieve them by avoiding war and negotiating the best possible terms for his people's inevitable transition to the reservation. This approach, coupled with his early death in 1881 by the hand of a Brule rival, has contributed to Spotted Tail's relative obscurity today. He never gained fame for winning a battle or a war against the whites, nor did his death attract the same level of publicity as did the killing of Crazy Horse by a soldier at Camp Robinson in 1877, or the fatal shooting of Sitting Bull by Indian police during the 1890 Ghost Dance turmoil. And, unlike Red Cloud, Spotted Tail did not live into the 20th century as the aged symbol of his generation of Lakota leaders. Born about 1823 and known in boyhood as Jumping Buffalo, Spotted Tail, or Sintagleska as his Indian name was, it's said that he got the name Spotted Tail because he often wore a raccoon tail when dressed for war or ceremonies. The young Spotted Tail was indeed touched by war, experiences that influenced him to renounce it later. He was present in August 1854 when Lieutenant John Grattan and his 29 men were wiped out near Fort Laramie after they fired on a massive Brule village while trying to arrest an Indian who had butchered an immigrant's cow. Spotted Tail participated in a retaliatory attack on a U.S. mail coach and was among the combatants during General William S. Harney's September 1855 rout of Little Thunder's Brule village at Blue Water Creek. Most of us are more familiar when we refer to it as the Battle of Ash Hollow. Harney's attack was the U.S. response to the killing of Lieutenant Grattan and his men. Soon afterwards, Spotted Tail gave himself up and was imprisoned for a year at Fort Leavenworth and other posts for his part in the mail coach attack. Although he joined in the so-called Indian War of 1865 following the brutal 1864 Sand Creek massacre of a peaceful Southern Cheyenne village by Colorado volunteers, his readiness for peace was signaled by his participation as a principal Brule spokesman during an 1866 treaty council at Fort Laramie. The 1866 negotiations failed to produce a treaty, but they led to the 1868 Fort Laramie Agreement that would become the basis for future Lakota government relations, a treaty Spotted Tail helped broker and promptly signed. During this time, he also succeeded in consolidating the war and peace factions of the Brule under his leadership. I think I pointed out, yes, Spotted Tail is the third from left in that slide. Equally important in cementing Spotted Tail's peaceful future were trips to Washington, D.C. in 1870, 1872, and 1875 to urge the government to live up to the 1868 treaty's promises. Not only did these sojourns further enlighten him to the enormous population and technological resources that the U.S. government could mobilize against Native peoples, but the concessions he gained during these negotiations confirmed his skills as a diplomat and solidified his role as his people's advocate. While he was aware that armed resistance could sometimes lead to dramatic victories, such as the destruction by Lakota warriors of Lieutenant William J. Fetterman and his 80 men near Fort Phil Kearney in 1866, Spotted Tail saw more clearly than most of his contemporaries that the Lakota would inevitably be overwhelmed in a protracted military campaign. Thus, he chose the diplomatic road instead of the warpath to help his people survive the dramatic changes that lay ahead. By 1871, some government officials were referring to Spotted Tail as, quote, the best Indian in this part of the country. Although Spotted Tail had no illusions that a reservation future could be avoided and had committed the Brule to the 1868 treaty that made it inevitable, he was determined to extend this transition for as long as possible to give his people time to adapt. The treaty created the Great Sioux Reservation, consisting of modern South Dakota lying west of the Missouri River. Whoops. Went too far. And it shows part of it here on this slide. It extended all the way up, and then was bordered on the east by the Missouri River. The food and supplies promised to the Brule as they transitioned to reservation life would be distributed at a government administrative center or agency located on a treeless plain next to the river. Spotted Tail detested this site, far from game and close to the whiskey peddlers, and wanted his agency moved where his people could continue to hunt as long as game held out. When he met with the president and other government officials in 1870, his well-reasoned complaints that the government was not living up to its obligations and his promises to keep the peace gained Spotted Tail permission to choose a new agency site. The shrewd Brule leader promptly used this concession to move his people away from the hated Missouri River to the interior, and then to select successive agency locations, each more suitable for hunting than for agriculture. It was part of his strategy to put off for as long as possible the day when his people would finally have to settle down and try to learn to be farmers. The first of the new agencies was temporarily located just south of the present town of Pine Ridge, which is the headquarters today of the Oglala Sioux Reservation. That would be somewhere in this vicinity on Big White Clay Creek. The next site, and very soon thereafter, was actually located on the White River near today's little hamlet of Whitney, Nebraska, which is just west of Chadron, between Chadron and Crawford. So that would put it about here. They were only there a few months when the agency was moved again to the White River further downstream at the mouth of Beaver Creek. And that particular site actually shows on this map. It's labeled as Old Whetstone Agency, right here. And it was called the Whetstone Agency through most of these moves simply because the very first Missouri River Agency was on Whetstone Creek, so that it was always Spotted Tail's agency, but it wasn't named for him until sort of the last agency site that they occupied in Nebraska. Then finally, in 1874, the agency was moved once again farther down Beaver Creek to its final Nebraska site north of today's Hay Springs, where it remained until 1877. Except for the first Missouri River Agency, the others were not on the Great Sioux Reservation, but in Nebraska's Pine Ridge country, a locale that the Brule much preferred to the dry Dakota Plains. Between 1870 and 1877, the agency was moved so often that some said that it existed only on wheels. Nevertheless, during the 9 years after the Fort Laramie Treaty was signed in 1866, the Brule, under Spotted Tail's leadership, managed to avoid taking up farming while at the same time remaining at peace. The 1868 treaty also granted the Oglala and Brule the right to hunt north of the North Platte River and on the Republican River for as long as enough buffalo remained to justify the chase. This concession also helped the Brule stall the government's plans for them to start practicing agriculture. Spotted Tail's people used the hunting right to leave the agency several times, despite the government's discouragement. The government also undercut its own efforts to persuade the Indians to remain at their agencies when it invited Spotted Tail to join the famous buffalo hunt that the Army had arranged for the Russian Grand Duke Alexis in January of 1872. Spotted Tail was only too happy to bring his family and some of his followers to the hunting camp on Red Willow Creek in southwestern Nebraska to provide native color for the Grand Duke's enjoyment. Along with Buffalo Bill and the 7th Cavalry's George Armstrong Custer, Spotted Tail became something of a star at this event. And at this point, if you really want to know more about that episode, I happen to have here a little book, and I see one of the authors sitting in the back, that covers the whole story of the famous buffalo hunt, including some of these same photographs that I have here, and tells about what Spotted Tail was doing. So these are available. Don't ignore it. So here we have Spot's teepee there at the campsite, and there are several photos. I'm only including a couple of them. Another one shows, rather blurry image, but nonetheless a real image of Spotted Tail and General Custer sitting in front of, I assume that's Custer's tent, or anyway, they're both there. Hunting as a means of subsistence for the residents of the Nebraska agencies was soon to end regardless. The first blow came when the Brule and Oglala warriors attacked Pawnee buffalo hunters at the so-called Battle of Massacre Canyon in southwestern Nebraska during late summer 1873. Though Spotted Tail was not directly involved, one of his confidants had been assigned to lead the Brule hunters. The second blow to maintaining the treaty-authorized hunting right was the near extinction in the mid-1870s by hide hunters of the buffalo herds along the Republican and the Platte. Therefore, both Spotted Tail and Red Cloud were willing, albeit reluctantly, to accept a government payment of $25,000 to give up the right to hunt away from the reservation. They signed the agreement in the summer of 1875. That same year, Spotted Tail would face his greatest diplomatic challenge: how to preserve Lakota title to the Black Hills, or failing that, to get the best possible deal from the government for giving them up. The Custer Expedition's 1874 discovery of gold in the hills, itself a violation of the 1868 treaty, brought the question to the forefront. Once the news got out, would-be miners began ignoring the treaty's ban against white trespass on the reservation. While the Army tried to keep them out initially, a trickle of miners became a flood by the summer of 1875. Some Lakota prepared to fight, while others, such as Spotted Tail and Red Cloud, insisted that the government at least needed to compensate the Lakota for the invasion of the hills. After all, the region had been confirmed to them by the 1868 treaty, which also provided that reservation land could not be ceded without the agreement of 3/4 of all adult Lakota men. Accordingly, the government appointed a commission headed by U.S. Senator William B. Allison to confer with the Indians and try to negotiate a sale. In September 1875, the commission arrived at the Red Cloud Agency to meet with representatives from the Red Cloud and Spotted Tail bands and from the Lakota Agency still located along the Missouri River, which were Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, and Lower Brule. Many of the delegates attending were willing to sell the Black Hills if the price was right. The non-agency bands under Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, who had not signed the 1868 treaty and never agreed to live at an agency, declined to participate, although a small delegation came to monitor and, if necessary, disrupt any potential sale. Because the talks were held near their Nebraska agencies, Spotted Tail and Red Cloud were the principal negotiators on behalf of the Lakota who entertained the possibility of selling the Black Hills. They and many of their headmen knew it would be difficult, if not impossible, to keep control of the region now that the white man wanted it. Both recognized that the government not only had the power to seize the territory outright, which it soon would do, but also the resources to compensate the Indians in a meaningful way if a deal could be struck. The plan the Indians came up with conceded the sale of the hills if the government would continue to support them for several generations. Giving up the only way of life they had ever known to become farmers and stockmen would be difficult. Spotted Tail and the other leaders also recognized what the government officials and other whites seemingly did not. It would take far more than the few years of government support authorized by the 1868 treaty to accomplish such a dramatic transformation, particularly because the Sioux Reservation land was poorly suited for agriculture and the Indians had no background as farmers. Because the government was forcing this change upon the Lakota, it was only right that it aid them along the way. It would be far cheaper to continue to feed the Indians than to fight them. The question of whether signatures of 3/4 of all the adult Lakota males could have been secured on an agreement to sell the Black Hills became moot. The government had authorized the commission to offer up to $6 million to buy the region, far less than the value of the long-term aid the Indians wanted and deserved. With the parties at an impasse, Spotted Tail urged that negotiations continue in Washington, D.C. if necessary, and that the president be involved. His appeal not to give up too soon speaks to his previous experience in dealing with high government officials and his willingness to compromise to reach an agreement that both parties could accept. When the Indians refused the $6 million offer as being too little, the government considered the matter closed, particularly after the Allison Commission's report blamed the non-treaty bands for the breakdown in negotiations and urged that the Army round them up. The government canceled even the half-hearted effort to keep the miners out of the Black Hills and then demanded that all Lakota move into an agency or the Army would force them to do so. When Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and their followers ignored the order, the Army launched a campaign that became known as the Great Sioux War of 1876-77. Both Spotted Tail and Red Cloud stayed on the sidelines and managed, though not with complete success, to keep their people out of it. In the aftermath of the Indians' defeat of Custer's 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn in late June 1876, another commission was sent out to the agencies not to negotiate, but to issue an ultimatum. Unless the Lakota signed away the Black Hills, the government would cut off the food and other commodities it had been providing them. There was no real effort to collect the number of signatures the 1868 treaty required, but when the agency leaders and headmen were cowed into signing by the threat of starvation, the Senate ratified the Black Hills Agreement, proclaiming government ownership of the Black Hills. Although they had not gone to war, the agency bands were suspected of having aided the fighting warriors. As punishment, the Army took control of the agencies in the fall of 1876 and seized the Indians' horses. Only Spotted Tail's people were apparently allowed to keep their ponies. Due to Red Cloud's perceived misbehavior, General George Crook appointed Spotted Tail as chief over the residents of both Nebraska agencies. Here's a photo showing the deed itself. That's General Crook, and there's Spotted Tail right next to him. This was at Red Cloud Agency, as it says. Spotted Tail never exercised this conferred authority, and Red Cloud ignored it, but it does reflect the government's high regard for the Brule leader. That regard increased in the spring of 1877 when Spotted Tail was instrumental in persuading his nephew, Crazy Horse, to surrender at Red Cloud Agency. According to Lieutenant Jesse Lee, commanding the Army post at Camp Sheridan, adjacent to the Spotted Tail Agency, the great result of the surrender, quote, has been mainly accomplished by Spotted Tail. He has, though an Indian untutored and uncivilized, been the means of saving hundreds of lives and thousands of dollars of treasure to the government, end quote. Nevertheless, after Crazy Horse was killed at Camp Robinson in September 1877 while the Army was trying to imprison him, both the Oglala and Brule were finally forced to move out of Nebraska to Dakota Territory, where today they live on the Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations. At the latter place, Spotted Tail would have fewer than 4 years left to help smooth his people's way forward. On August 5th, 1881, Spotted Tail was shot and killed by his Brule rival, Crow Dog. The underlying motives behind this event remain murky. One scholar concluded that some of Spotted Tail's actions after the move to the new reservation, quote, pushed the boundaries of Lakota tradition, reverberating to the very heart of Lakota concepts of honor and power, giving many Brule a reason to oppose him, end quote. Spotted Tail's forceful leadership style had been acceptable while his people struggled to understand and accept their new relationship with the U.S. government, and it had helped slow their removal from their preferred places of residence and kept them out of war. Once they had settled into reservation life, some Brule apparently wanted a return to a more consensual, community-based governance. Even the biography issued by Spotted Tail's namesake university on the Rosebud Reservation notes that the reasons he was murdered, quote, are complex, controversial, and so sensitive that for the time being, no complete picture of what occurred can be drawn. This is a photo from later, but it's said to show the area near which Spotted Tail was murdered in 1881. Some of the characteristics that made Spotted Tail effective as his people's diplomat and spokesman and earned him respect and praise from his white contemporaries included his direct and pragmatic approach and his lively sense of humor. Accounts of Spotted Tail in action, along with what he had to say, even though they are recorded by white observers, provide some insight. D.C. Poole, one of the government agents for the Brule, first met Spotted Tail in 1870 and remembered him as being, quote, never very eloquent, but he was direct and forcible and usually to the point, end quote. Poole also accompanied the 1870 delegation to Washington, D.C., where Spotted Tail complained about the government's failure to provide promised supplies and protested the location of his agency. Quote, he made no allusion to himself, but talked of his people and their wants, and was a most faithful advocate, end quote. Some of Spotted Tail's soon-to-be famous wit also emerged during a dinner at the White House. Quote, Spotted Tail said that the white men had many more good things to eat and drink than they ever sent out to the Indians. He was told that that was because the white man had quitted the warpath and gone to farming. The chief exclaimed that he would do the same provided he could be as well treated and live in as big a house, end quote. When the Black Hills crisis burst upon the Lakota in 1874-75, Spotted Tail's response and his role in the negotiations drew much attention from journalists and government officials. In May 1875, Spotted Tail, Red Cloud, and other leading Oglala and Brule were summoned to the nation's capital to meet with government officials. They stopped in Omaha on the way, and this picture was taken there in front of, or in a studio with Julius Meyer, who ran a famous Indian curio shop there in Omaha. So this was taken as they were heading to Washington, D.C. in 1875. When Secretary of the Interior Columbus Delano urged the Indians to accept the $25,000 Congress had appropriated to buy out the Indians' right to hunt buffalo on the Republican and north of the Platte, Spotted Tail's rejoinder was that if the government would add another $15,000 to the amount, we will throw in the buffalo, which prompted a laugh from both the Indians and the whites. Delano asked the interpreter to explain to him that only $25,000 was available, and another laugh rippled through the audience when Spotted Tail replied, quote, "You told me you had no money, so I do not ask for your money, but the money of Congress," end quote. After returning from the 1875 Washington trip, Spotted Tail and his agent, E.A. Howard, visited the Black Hills mining camps to see for themselves what was going on. There, Spotted Tail was interviewed by a New York Tribune correspondent who asked what he thought about the miners. The chief replied, quote, "We are wronged. The Great Father's promises are broken. This land is not bought yet. It belongs to us still. We are to have a council soon about it," end quote. When the correspondent remarked that white men were fond of gold and it was hard to prevent them from hunting for it, Spot replied, quote, "It is stealing. If this country belonged to the whites and Indians wanted to get gold, they would have to buy it. Whites are different. They come and take it," end quote. In a pretty gutsy move then, Spotted Tail actually made a speech to a mass meeting of miners and scolded them roundly for trespassing. The correspondent reported that more than one miner, quote, "itched to take out a pistol." Whether or not the old fellow, Spotted Tail, was conscious of the danger there might be in stirring these men up was not indicated by word or look. Someone laughed in derision at his claim for damages. He said, "White men laugh while I talk. If a squaw did that while a white man were talking in my camp, she would be whipped," end quote. Despite the seriousness of the September 1875 negotiations about selling the Black Hills, Spotted Tail tried to sound a lighthearted note from time to time. During a visit with Red Cloud agent John J. Seville, some of the latter's Oglala charges came begging. Quote, "Red Dog," an Oglala, wanted Dr. Seville to give him a blanket. He was asked what he wanted of it. Spotted Tail answered, "He will get a blanket from you, then he will want a horse from me to put under it." Whereupon Red Dog was laughed at and changed the subject, end quote. There's the famous Red Dog himself. When the first formal session of the 1875 Council opened on September 20th, Chairman Allison proposed that the government would like to lease the hills from the Indians until all the gold was gone, and then the Indians could have them back. This proposal drew great laughter and sparked Spotted Tail's sense of the ridiculous. As the whites were returning to Red Cloud Agency afterwards, quote, "The ambulance conveying the newspaper man overtook a light spring wagon in which Spotted Tail was seated, whereupon the latter called out, 'I would like to get your mules to haul wood this winter and return them in the spring,' thus making a sly drive at the proposition he had just listened to relative to the Black Hills country, and which joke was fully appreciated by the occupants of the ambulance," end quote. Of course, the correspondents, including Reuben Davenport of the New York Herald, pestered the Lakota leaders for interviews, which was nothing new for Spotted Tail. Although he had a justifiable reputation for being affable and forthcoming, he could not resist some fun at Davenport's expense. According to another reporter, quote, "Frank Yates, one of the agency traders, tells the best one on the Herald chap. He says the latter visited Spotted Tail for the purpose of inspecting him, and that Spotted Tail finally consented to the affliction on condition that he would first pay him $10 and an interpreter $5. Then the correspondent prepared himself for a good square talk, but had received answers to only a few preliminary questions when old Spot arose and quietly walked away with the remark, 'There, young man, I guess you've got about $15 worth.' And that was the end of the interview," end quote. His good humor notwithstanding, Spotted Tail could be extremely direct in calling the government to account or skewering what he considered shortcomings of the supposedly civilized whites. After the Black Hills Council was over, one correspondent visited Spotted Tail's camp and the talk turned to religion. When asked about his religious beliefs, the chief said, quote, "All good men, whether they are white or red, go to heaven. But a great difference will exist between the conditions of the races of men and individuals there and what they are here. everything nearly will be reversed. Here the Great Spirit has been on the white man's side. There he will lean to the cause of the Indian, and then, said the chief, his eyes flashing in the meantime a fearful realization of the present condition of his people, we'll fight it out and will not be driven from our hunting grounds like the sneaking savage wolf. The bad men of all nations will go down into the center of the earth and be excluded from the spirit land. End quote. The same reporter then asked whether Spotted Tail knew about Jesus Christ, to which he replied, quote, "Yes, I have heard all about him, how good he was, what great things he did, how he would help the bad man to be good, and how he would lead all who would listen to him to the Great Spirit, his Father. And I have also heard how the white man killed him. The Indian never would have done that. He never would have murdered the Son of the Great Spirit. It was for a long time after I first heard about Jesus Christ that I did not understand how the white man could have killed him. But when I got better acquainted with the whites, when I realized the fact that they had no respect for the rights of the Indian, would take away his home where he was born, murder him and his children, despoil his women, and rob him of his winter's food, I then very readily understood how they could even kill the Son of the Great Spirit as they did." End quote. Just before Spotted Tail and his headman signed the 1876 agreement giving up the Black Hills, Spotted Tail delivered a speech to the commissioners indicting the government's treatment of his people. Quote, "This seems to me to be a very hard day. Half of our country is at war, and we have come upon very difficult times. This war did not spring up here in our land. It was brought upon us by the children of the Great Father, who came to take our land from us without price, and who do a great many evil things. The Great Father and his children are to blame for this trouble. We have here a storehouse to hold our provisions, but the Great Father sends us very little provisions to put in our storehouse. And when our people become displeased with our provisions and have gone north to hunt, the children of the Great Father are fighting them. It has been our wish to live here peaceably, but the Great Father is filled in with soldiers who think only of our death. Some of our people who have gone from here in order that they may have a change, and others who have gone north to hunt, have been attacked by soldiers from this direction. And when they have got north, have been attacked by soldiers from another direction. And now when they are willing to come back, the soldiers stand between them and keep them from coming home. It seems to me there is a better way than this when people come to trouble. It is better for both parties to come together without arms, talk it over, and find some peaceful way to settle it." End quote. After the 1876 Commission had gained the so-called agreement to seize the Black Hills, Spotted Tail and others were taken to examine Indian Territory, present Oklahoma, where the government hoped the Brule would agree to move. But Spotted Tail stood fast in arguing that they should be allowed to remain where they had always lived. Quote, "I looked at the whole of the country well and hoped I would find a country resembling this one, the one I was born in and have lived in. All my wishes were to go in a place where I could do for my people for their good as I have heretofore, to go to a place where I could raise stock and grain and look to their benefit in the future. When I returned from that country, I studied a great deal on what the Great Father promised me. These promises I was thinking of all the way coming back. None of them have been fulfilled. One of those promises is this. The Great Father told me when I was in Washington we should be supplied with plows, oxen, wagons, seeds, and all necessary utensils for farming. This we never received yet. The commissioners came here and bargained for the Black Hills. I gave them the Black Hills for the consideration that they should support us for so many years. But before we could get through with our councils, the whites went there and stole the country and have taken the gold from there ever since." End quote. In the end, the Brule were not forced to move to Indian Territory, and they remain today on the Rosebud Reservation in south-central South Dakota. Spotted Tail is buried on a hill overlooking the reservation headquarters and the Santa Gleska University bearing his name. Given the loss of the Black Hills and the imposition of reservation life on Spotted Tail's people, what had he really accomplished? This is what the historians have to say. George E. Hyde authored the earliest study called Spotted Tails Folk, published in 1961. Quote, "This Brule chief made friends of the high officials who held the fate of his people in their hands and obtained from them by friendly persuasion advantages for the Sioux that the fighting chiefs like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse could not win by war and indeed did not value. These things were peace and time and aid to enable the Sioux to change from the hunting life." End quote. According to Robert Larson, author of Red Cloud, Warrior Statesman of the Lakota Sioux, published in 1997, quote, "Spotted Tail was probably more realistic about the plight of his people than even Red Cloud. He probably dominated his own people more effectively than any other Lakota leader. His stabilizing tenure may have helped make the Brule one of the most stable and prosperous Sioux tribes of the modern era." Kingsley Bray, who wrote the outstanding biography of Crazy Horse, A Lakota Life, published in 2006, cited Spotted Tail's, quote, "moral example of wary, gradualist acceptance of change that established a Brule consensus that would hold through the war years into the 20th century. Through a century of economic switchbacks and downturns on the reservation, the Brule adaptation, a grim but realistic acceptance of the changes forced upon them while retaining fundamental Lakota values, has held good." End quote. I'm going to give the last word here to Victor Duville, who's the head, or was when the website was created, the head of the Lakota Studies Department at Senegleska University. Quote, "This need for survival prompted Spotted Tail to stress and advocate the idea of accepting the minimal but basic aspects of the Wasatch tool of education for survival in the white-dominated world. Senegleska University embraces the lofty vision Senegleska had for the people, that is, to take up and master the skills of the white man so that the people may live." That's it. Thank you very much. If you have some questions, I'll try to answer them. Gosh, I must have covered it. Anyway, Spotted Tail is one of my favorites, and he deserves a little more recognition than I think he's gotten, and so some of us are going to try to change that. There's a project afoot to maybe write a new kind of a collective biography of Spotted Tail in which several of us will contribute specific chapters. We'll see how it goes. It's kind of in the planning stages at this point, but we'd like to do it, so keep your eyes peeled. Yes, sir?
Are there any direct descendants of Spotted Tail?
Well, I think there are. I tell you, the question was, are there any direct descendants of Spotted Tail? I think up on the reservation there will be some descendants. In fact, a few years ago, my wife was, until just recently, the director of the Museum of the Fur Trade in Chadron. And the museum is actually on the site of a little trading post that operated for the Brule back in the 1830s and 40s. So at least on one occasion, some people from the reservation visited there, and I think they were, in fact, descendants of Spotted Tail. There's a lot of names up on the reservation that connect to a lot of different figures in history, and I can't give the specifics on who they might be, but I think it's pretty safe to say there are descendants up there. Anybody else have any opinion on that or know any more than I do about it? Yes, sir.
A different subject, but did the Indian leaders try to learn English early on so they couldn't negotiate with our government leaders?
The question was, did the Indian leaders try to learn English so that they would be in a better position perhaps to negotiate with the government? I think generally speaking, probably not. Although I have to think maybe Spotted Tail and some others, by the time this was all said and done, probably at least understood some English, but invariably when I've found these different accounts, there's always an interpreter involved, and I don't know if that was a deliberate policy of refusing to learn English, but I think it probably gave the native leaders a little bit of empowerment because they were forcing the white negotiators to accept their terms of language and so on. On the other hand, I think it's entirely probable that in many cases, given that the interpreters were not always the best that might have been out there, that's also a source of some of the misunderstandings that took place, because some of these interpreters were mixed bloods that were living in the Indian camps, and they were trusted by the native leaders, but they themselves didn't always have the best command of the English language. So in many cases, I think the translations left something to be desired.
Does that Sioux language still exist?
I believe so, yes. The question was, does the Sioux or Lakota language still exist? And I believe they teach it at the Nebraska University and probably other places. There are still some people that are fluent in it, and I know there's an effort on the part of the older Lakotas to make sure that it somehow gets transmitted to the younger people. So I think there are probably still many speakers of Lakota out there. At least I've encountered a few of them, because a couple years ago I was overseeing the Historical Society Museum at Fort Robinson for the summer, and on several occasions I would help and conduct tours that were brought down to the fort by people from the reservation who were bringing, generally speaking, younger people to see where Crazy Horse was killed, and they conducted some of their own ceremonies in their own language. So it's probably like a lot of native languages. It's not as robust as people would like it to be, but hopefully it'll maintain.
Jim, what's your opinion on the motives for Spotted Tail's murder?
Well, I guess I'm just like everybody else. It's hard to say. The question, I forgot to ask. The question was, what's my opinion on the motives for Spotted Tail's murder? There have been stories that he was something of a womanizer, and whether that's true or not, I just don't know. But if the people at Senegleska either don't want to talk about it or don't know how to explain it, I guess I wouldn't be in a very good position to speculate. But the one scholar I cited thought it was in part at least due to the fact that after the reservation period started, the leadership style that Spotted Tail had used and probably needed to use during the pre-reservation period maybe kind of started to rub some people the wrong way. That's a topic to investigate. If nothing else, I appreciate very much your attention and thank you for coming.